Welcome to CinemaKC. I'm Erin McGrain, your host. Tonight, Redbird by Misty Boland. Town Teams by Mark Honer. Next, we visit another KC movie location with Teresa O'Leary. And Grasp by Kestrel Erickson. Right here on CinemaKC.
What the f*** is that? Shut up!
Both of you shut up. She's coming.
Ah! Oh, no!
She's coming! You'll never...
Ah! 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 Ah!
I need you to tell me where he is.
He'll kill me!
That'll be a goddamn luxury right about now.
And I have money. Furs, moonshine.
Give me the toy you stole from my boy.
I knew we could come to some sort of an agreement.
Don't miss any of the Redbird series episodes by going to redbirdseries.com.
I started researching the oil boom in southeast Kansas. It was 100 years ago, so I was sort of the 100-year anniversary of the oil boom in Kansas. And really, during the course of the research, I started coming across tons and tons of just photos of teams. And they were teams that played for small towns. No town was too small. It was a tiny town. Maybe 100 people would have a team. And once a week, they would get together, watch their town team play. At some point I think we did a little research on 1910 to 1920, something like 500 small town baseball teams just in Kansas. And that was sort of the social media of the time. It's how people got together, and it became so much more than just baseball, and it really consumed these towns. I mean, the population of the United States back then was more rural than urban. People in the small towns, they didn't really care that much about Major League Baseball. They cared more about, their brother John, who played on the town team, and their dad. And really, it became, just as all small towns compete, it became how towns competed with each other. This was sort of the way that they promoted themselves to sort of become the county seat, or to get Highway 24 to go through Beloit rather than going through, some other town. What I fell in love with these players because it was about a time when baseball was for the love of the game and it wasn't about a buck. I'm Mark Honer. My film is Town Team Baseball, about baseball at the turn of the 20th century in Kansas.
1800s, baseball had exploded in popularity across the plains of Kansas. Town team games like this were played in every corner of the relatively young state. No town was too small to field a team. Places like Tyro, Stockton, Elmo, and Leota. Kansas would produce more than its share of major league players, but in the villages and towns, the passion was focused on the local team, the town team. So while the big city press covered future Hall of Famers like Walter Johnson, Joe Tinker, and Smokey Joe Wood, the local household names were guys like Tom Blodgett, Ike Thompson, and Fred Dad Bramble, none of which would ever make it to the big leagues. But these men and thousands of other ball players across Kansas would have an impact on their communities that would stretch far beyond the baseball field, affecting everything from economic growth and competition to labor relations to the assimilation of immigrants into the American way of life. Local baseball heroes provided much more than just entertainment and rivalry. They became part of the culture that helped build Kansas, making town teams bigger than baseball.
Oh my God.
Bill Hess is watching film of himself playing baseball from 70 years ago. As the memories come rushing back, the delight on his face and in his voice is a joy to behold.
There, that's me. I know that's me.
Hess hasn't looked at this film for 40 years, but seeing his reaction explains a lot about why the game became so popular in Kansas and across the country.
Oh, I couldn't wait to get there to play. No, that was an exciting time on Sunday when the big crowd, you just don't believe the crowds would be there on Sunday. There was always people sitting out there on their car fenders or hanging out the windows of their cars and hollering at us. And, it was an exciting time. Everybody went because the grandstand was always full.
Hess is describing the games he played for the Rossville town team in the 1940s, but the picture he paints is identical to the photos and newspaper accounts of the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it explains much about the popularity of the game.
The reason baseball was so popular is partly that everybody knew it. It was very familiar to them. Children have been playing it at recess, school recess, since the 1830s. Everybody knew baseball.
And as the cities grew, it was a way of relieving the humdrum existence of working in a factory or working in a shop, working in an office, go out and play ball.
It was the game that Grandpa played, that Dad played, that I play, and my sons will play. And so in an intrinsic way and in a personal way, it very much then touches the American personality because of these memories. Well, by the mid to late 1800s, baseball became the central sport of Americana, without question, because everybody played it.
The number of teams scattered across the plains of Kansas was truly staggering. In 1910, for instance, there were 24 minor league clubs playing in 4 leagues across the state. These players were just barely professional, but they had to be paid a monthly salary to be considered in the minors. The semi-pro teams had players who might be paid with a job or a cut of the gate. Then there were the traveling teams, which often used salaried players and traveled hundreds of miles to play other teams. In the cities, leagues were formed for amateur players, often built around an industry like oil or the railroads. The lines between these teams often blurred. But by far the largest class of teams was the amateur town teams. An unofficial search of Kansas newspapers from 1911 to 1920 shows more than 300 small-town teams were playing ball.
Everybody in town would turn out. It was the day. It was what you had. It was like the big parades coming to town. Whenever they played ball, The whole town showed up.
And the number of people at the game could actually exceed the official population of the town sometimes. Businesses would shut down early mid-afternoon so that all the clerks and everybody could go watch the baseball game.
Sometimes they had automobiles parked all the way around, and everybody would sit in their automobiles and watch the game from there too.
And so they would have, sometimes the horses and the carriages would line up along the foul lines, people would line up, and they were in essence the fence.
The large crowds and rivalries were fueled by alcohol and gambling.
It's probably the most under-recognized aspect of baseball, because people would gamble on the game.
There are recorded instances where, a fly ball's coming out and somebody says, I'll give you $50 or $20 if you drop that ball. And he does, okay?
Everybody bet, even the women bet. So it was all right until someone brought liquor into the stands. And then there was threats, anger, fights, and they might have to bring in some law.
In fact, it wasn't unusual to see punches thrown in an early Kansas baseball game. The times were raw, and so were the players.
They were probably a lot tougher. They they were farm boys basically in Kansas anyway, or whatever whatever hard labor they were doing in Kansas at the time.
I mean, it was not uncommon for fights to break out on the field and spill over into the stands.
There was no decorum back then, so I mean, sure they're going to get in fights. If you hit one of them, or if you slid pretty hard, and these weren't rubber spikes back then; these were big-time spikes. So, sure, guys got in fights. I mean, the umpires weren't going to do anything to them, so they ended up in brawls, and then their towns would end up sometime in a brawl.
The news of the fight on the Parsons Diamond yesterday afternoon reached the city within an hour after it had happened. The entire team was in jail. The crowds in the grandstand and bleachers flocked out onto the diamond, and the umpire could not clear them away. The Pittsburgh Daily headline.
The effects of town team baseball touched nearly every part of life in Kansas, impacting the way we lived, played, and worked.
The amateurs really reflect the real America. The men that are for hire, they're employees, and I'm sure they love baseball, but they don't love it the way the amateurs do, because the amateurs are playing it simply because they love the game.
I just loved to being there and being on the field and catching them fly balls.
These guys are legendary, and their teams are legendary.
I was just so fortunate that I could play with those guys that I played with. They were all very good men, and the people that went to the game, it was just an exciting time.
But when people think of the golden age of baseball, they think about the major leagues, 1950s. But I think there's a golden age of town baseball that's even greater than the major leagues. Town ball, I think it's the forgotten piece of the whole baseball legacy.
I'm Teresa O'Leary with Movie Trip. I love traveling the world and tracking down the real-life locations of my favorite movies. Today I'm in Kansas City, the Paris of the Plains, barbecue capital of the world, and the city of fountains. Let's get started.
Based on Evan S. Connell's novel and told through the eyes of an upper-crust Kansas City couple, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge tracks Americans' modernization during and after the Second World War. The movie was produced by Ismael Merchant and James Ivory, who also made A Room with a View and The Remains of the Day, and it starred real-life Hollywood royalty Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, who was nominated for an Oscar for her performance.
Much of Mr. and Mrs. Bridge was filmed on location here in Kansas City. And in one scene, a young Jason Sudeikis makes an appearance as an extra right here.
Other scenes were filmed at the Liberty Memorial, the Savoy Grill, and Drexel Hall.
You might not think that Mr. and Mrs. Bridge has anything in common with Sacha Baron Cohen's Bruno, but incredibly it does. One of the more memorable scenes in Bruno was filmed just a few blocks from here at Hotel Phillips.
So much of Cohen's documentary is so outrageous that a lot of people wonder if it's really a documentary at all. But for the employees of this hotel, you'll see it really was.
They knew a European man would be staying here making a documentary, but that's it. The look of shock on the faces of the two employees was completely genuine, and what you see in Bruno is 100% accurate. Of course, we can't show you that scene here, but trust us, we couldn't make it up either.
Celebrity max out.
Thanks to a certain master of disguise, this hotel's now part of movie history. I'm Teresa O'Leary. See you next time.
Good. I started with a girl with no arms, and I gave her arms. That was my story at the beginning. I just really, really wanted to have a character with a whole bunch of arms coming out of her, and needed a story around that. So to give her conflict, I put her in jail, so she seems trapped. But she's not trapped. She can escape at any time. In fact, at the beginning, baby inmates are escaping, and she's like, well, I can go too. I'm just gonna go do that. And she grabs her little rabbit, and she keeps with her, and she goes to go escape too. But the only thing that holds her back are these scientists that want to give her something she doesn't need, or she doesn't think she needs, which are arms. And so it all goes horribly wrong. She's grown arms, and she doesn't know what to do with them. So she escapes from the scientists and the jail to go back to her rabbit. Grasp is gaining something that you didn't necessarily need, but then you're stuck with it now and you have to keep moving forward. My obsession with arms is just like, as an artist, I need them to draw. And I think about that a lot. Like, if I lost my hand, what would I do? For Harriet, who is my character, she doesn't have any. She doesn't need any. And then she's given limbs, and too many of them. And now she has to figure out what to do with them, and whether they're gonna help her move forward or whether they're gonna hold her back. My name is Kestrel Erickson, and my film is Grasp.